Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're talking about what are the risks of yield farming concentrated liquidity pools. If you guys have been watching content on YouTube, you see a ton of videos talking about like the APR you could generate with these liquidity pools. But today we're talking mainly about what are the risks, where you could be losing money so that you know exactly what you're investing in, right? It's very important to know the risks before you make any investment decisions because you have to be comfortable with taking that risk to be able to make money in the market. And concentrated liquidity pools is one of the best way to make money in DeFi. But at the same time, if you don't know what you're doing, you could be losing a lot of money in the process. And if you're new here, my name is Richard. I'm a yield farmer and DeFi investor. I've been able to make a few six figures from crypto, and a lot of my gains have been from yield farming as well. If you want to check out my portfolio, you can take a look at my portfolio update playlist. So let's dive right into the video. And again, none of this is meant to be financial advice. I'm just sharing what I've learned so that hopefully you could make more money and then lose less money in the process. So the first risk we're taking with yield farming concentrated liquidity pool is impermanent loss. And this is actually the main reason why a lot of DeFi investors just avoid concentrated LPs, like in general, just because they might not understand impermanent loss or how to actually use it to your advantage, right? Impermanent loss could be a more complex topic for beginners to understand. And I've made multiple videos talking about impermanent loss. So if you want to dive deeper into it, you could search impermanent loss on my channel. But basically, let's say you're yield farming an Ethereum to USDC pair, right? So the X value here is the Ethereum that you deposited. And then the Y value here is the USDC that you deposited. And for this simulation, we're going to run like a max upper range here just to show you the effects of impermanent loss in like a full range LP, right? So let's say Ethereum right now is close to $4,000. So we are depositing right now at $4,000. And let's say we deposit 100K just to make the number simple. And in the scenario of, let's say Ethereum goes up by 2x, so at $8,000, you will be suffering a little bit of impermanent loss in this case, right? And what you will see is that you would hold roughly 141K instead of this roughly 150K here if you were just to hold your assets separately. Because if you actually hold 50% Ethereum at the time of deposit, you would have about $50,000, right? And if Ethereum appreciates by 2x, that becomes $100,000 plus that other $50,000 of USDC you have inside the pool. So what you will see is that there's a minor difference here. The reason why is because if you're providing liquidity, some of your Ethereum is getting slowly converted to USDC, right? So you will be losing some of your Ethereum in the process. So when you're doing that, your capital appreciation is going to be slightly less than actually holding the assets separately. But it's not a big deal because with wider ranges, a lot of times our impermanent loss is going to be very little. So let's say 5.8% in this case, right? And if Ethereum drops to $2,000, for example, then we also see a 5.8% on the downside. So if price bounce between like 2,000 and 8,000 and kind of go back and forth, as long as you're generating more than like 6% over the next like 1 to 2 years or 2 to 3 years, then you're actually able to comfortably beat this impermanent loss number, right? And another advantage of this is that if you are a more conservative investor, even with a full range LP, you will still be able to earn a decent income around like 7 to 8% last I checked. And the APR could be different depending on the volume and the liquidity distribution as well. But you're going to be able to earn a nice steady income. And then your portfolio volatility would be less as well, simply because you are holding some USDC inside this LP, right? So that's the first thing to understand, that there is some impermanent loss. And if we adjust the upper range a little bit, let's just say your upper range is at 10,000 and then your lower range is at $2,000, right? So now this becomes a concentrated liquidity pool because now we're setting our range in like a specific price range rather than a full range LP, right? So in this case, let's just say the price deposit goes back to 4,000 and the price now is at 4,000. In this scenario, we're depositing a little bit more Ethereum here on the X value, and then the Y value is the USDC, right? But let's just try to make the comparison a bit more fair. So let's say I adjust the price lower to be around 1600. So at the deposit ratio, I would have about 50% Ethereum and then 50% USDC, right? So what I want to simulate in this case is, let's say price goes up to $8,000. What I'm able to see is that now I would be suffering about 15 to 16% in permanent loss rather than the initial 5 or 6% that we would be suffering, right? So the impermanent loss is much more in a concentrate LP, depending on how wide your range is. And you see the difference is like 150K and 126K, right? And of course, if you're not trading this asset, you could still be profitable over time if the APR you're able to generate is able to beat this impermanent loss. And sometimes our goal is not even to beat impermanent loss, right? We just want some cash flow with our investment. So it's all right to be underperforming, holding a little bit. And we never know like how aggressive a price movement could be, right? Ethereum could be grinding sideways for years. Let's just say like Ethereum just goes up to $6,000 in the next 2 years, right? In that case, our impermanent loss would be very little at around 6%. And then let's just say you're generating about 15 to 20% with this LP, then you would be comfortably outperforming holding in this case. So when it comes to yield farming concentrate pools, we want to actually know the impermanent loss that we could suffer beforehand before we even deploy into these pools. And what I want to share with you guys really quickly here is this is one of my client portfolio. And what I want to highlight here is that sometimes outperforming holding doesn't actually matter because you never know what the price action would be, right? When we were yield farming this Ethereum to USDC pair, we set our range from about $1,500 to about $4,300. And we didn't really expect the price to like bounce back that fast. So then we were in range for about like 98%. We were yield farming from about April 5th until August 12th. So about 4 months here. And we actually made pretty nice profit from this, right? We deposited $50,000. And what we were able to withdraw is around 68,000 plus the fees earning here. So roughly like $22,000, $23,000 of profit. Of course, we would have profited more like holding it separately, but that's the risk with concentrated liquidity pools. Sometimes if you set the ranges a bit tighter and you're trying to get a bit more fees out of it, then the price action is actually very aggressive, either to the upside or the downside. You would have been better off just holding in the market. But of course, we never know what the prices are going to do. If the price is just kind of bouncing like within range for like 1 to 2 months, or right now is cracking below like $4,000, right? We would still be in range in that case. So then this versus HODL profit and loss would kind of bump up, but then our net profit would drop as well if Ethereum drops back in price, right? So in this scenario, is it better to lock in the profit or try to outperform holding? Most of the time, it's just better to just lock in the profit. It doesn't matter if you underperform holding a little bit. And oftentimes, if it's a crypto to crypto pool, we're able to outperform holding in the market, right? If you're looking at the open position here, especially with wider range LPs, there's a lot of opportunity to outperform holding in the market with our current position. For example, this position has been in range for quite a while, and the range is quite wide, right? From $2,500 to about $100,000 on the upside. It's earning a pretty modest 10% APR. It's still better than like staking Ethereum or lending out USDC separately, especially if you're not taking leverage. This is a really solid return, and it's outperforming holding by a large margin. So that is pretty much pure profit, right? Some strategies that basically underperform impermanent loss by too much, or it is actually bleeding out in capital, a lot of your fees are not going to be what you take home at the end of the day. But a lot of times, if your goal is to actually make profit in the market, we don't want to overanalyze impermanent loss because again, the price could go up to like $10,000 on the upside. For example, you would be suffering impermanent loss, but then you're also locking in some profit on the way up. So you're slowly selling your Ethereum in this case, right? And then typically to hedge our upside exposure, we want to have more spot Ethereum or staked Ethereum. so that you have full capital appreciation as well. So in a balanced portfolio, then this type of performance is completely fine, especially because sometimes these assets do grind sideways for a very long time where these concentrated LPs would shine, right? So that's the first thing. There is impermanent loss that you need to deeply understand before you actually provide liquidity. Otherwise, it could not be worth your time. And then second thing that we want to understand is that there's an asset depreciation risk. So when you're providing liquidity, you're exposed to the underlying asset, right? In that case, you were exposed to Ethereum and USDC. If USDC, for example, like depeg, then you're at risk there. It's not very likely that USDC would depeg, but it could happen in theory. So that's a risk that you're taking. Or if you're just actually providing liquidity for tokens that bleed out, for example, right? So there is an asset depreciation risk there. For example, if you were yield farming AVAX to USDC, especially running tight range strategies, and the price just kind of have been trending down, and you got in at maybe in 2024 when the market was overheated, it's very likely that you would be suffering a loss if the price trends down over time, right? This is very important because you don't want to be providing liquidity for assets that would be likely to bleed out over time. Of course, we never know like which assets are going to survive or do really well in the next like 1 to 2 years, but we want to try to bet on assets that have a good chance to actually appreciate in value rather than depreciate in value, right? For example, again, AVAX, we don't know if the prices are going to recover or not. And that's the risk that you have to take. And it's the same risk as if you were to buy these altcoins anyway, right? If you buy these altcoins and these altcoins bleed out, you're going to lose money. And then if you're providing liquidity for these altcoins, a lot of times if they bleed out, your fees are not going to be able to cover the loss if the bleed out is too aggressive over time, right? Sometimes the fees are able to outprint the loss that you're suffering from the drawdown. But at the same time, if the APR is not high enough and the drawdown is like too aggressive, then you could still lose money over time. So it's always a good idea to only provide liquidity for assets that you believe in and would have a chance to appreciate in value over time. For example, I just deployed some liquidity into a hype to USDT pool. Of course, with a crypto to stable pool, there is more volatility and that impermanent loss could be a factor. But in this case, I'm not really trying to like outperform holding too much. I just want some APR and then I'm also accumulating both hype and USDT, right? So that's a great deal for me. And then you can decide if it's worth your risk or not. And the third risk that we have to worry about is the smart contract risk. So when we're deploying liquidity into these DEXs, we do have to interact with smart contracts. You're depositing directly on platforms like Uniswap, PancakeSwap, Curve, Radium, or these other DEXs. And usually the higher the total value locked, the safer it is. And then you also want to look into the audit reports of these DEXs if they're newer. But protocols like Uniswap that have been around for a very long time, it's battle tested. It's pretty safe compared to other DEXs. But if you're diving deeper down into these smaller DEXs, like maybe Camelot, and some of these I have never even looked into, right? It could be way riskier than sticking with like the top DEXs that are on this list. And again, you guys want to be looking into like the audit and see if there has been any history of a hack or something that affected the protocol. And we want to make sure that our funds are secure. And one thing that you guys could also do is you could buy insurance for the different DEXs if you're worried about the protocol safety. And I do typically recommend this for my clients that have more than like 100K or a lot of money that is inside the LPs. So this is really good if you want to be protected. You can buy coverage for some of these protocols that gets exploited. For example, the Uniswap V3 protocol, it's only 0.17% annually if you're buying it in ETH. And it's still under 1% if you're buying it in US dollar, right? This is really good. You could buy like the different coverage and you want to make sure you read the terms as well. For example, if you made a loss from like different phishing or private key security breach, malware, it's not going to cover that. But if it's like a smart contract exploit, then of course you could file a claim and try to get some of the money back. And you could do partial coverage as well. Let's say you deposited 100 ETH and you could do, let's say 75 ETH. If you want to do partial coverage to save some of the costs, it's typically better to do some coverage rather than no coverage at all. And I do believe that you need to KYC for this, but it's still a good idea in my opinion. And you should be able to KYC anyway if you are not doing some like shady stuff like evading taxes or stuff like that, right? So that's the smart contract risk. And another risk that we have to think about is the custodian risk. Some tokens like Wrap Bitcoin is actually going through a custodian, right? If you search this on CoinMarketCap, and read the about section of the Wrap Bitcoin, you can dive deeper into the specific mechanics of each Wrap tokens. Like in this case, if you read closely, BitGo is the biggest custodian for Wrap Bitcoin, but there are other custodians that is involved, like the Kuiper network. So we have to look into that and make sure that we're spreading out our risk. It's usually a great idea to not use like only one wrapper token. This is equivalent to like parking all of your funds in one centralized exchange like Binance. So if you don't want to do that, then we want to use a wide variety of these tokens. For example, you could be buying the Wrap Bitcoin, and then we could also be buying the Coinbase Wrap Bitcoin. So this way you're diversifying across custodians in case one of the custodian had a security breach or is just a bad actor. You're not going to lose all of your funds. And here on Nexus Mutual, you could even buy the Wrap Bitcoin DPEG insurance, right? You could be buying this and then it covers you from the Wrap Bitcoin DPEG. If it depegs by 10% or more for more than 7 days, right? You could file a claim here. And it even covers like the crime related loss. So this could be good if you're parking a lot of funds with the Wrap Bitcoin. And this even covers like the stablecoin DPEGs, right? For example, USDAI is pretty popular recently. There's the USDT0 by Tether or the Athena USDE DPEG. And of course, some of these are quite expensive. So the best way to go about it is to either like buy partial cover or just diversify your assets across custodians and also hold some raw Bitcoin, right? It's always a good idea to hold some raw Bitcoin. And lastly, the fifth risk, and in my opinion, the biggest risk is that you're just inexperienced when it comes to yield farming concentrated liquidity pools. There's a ton of ways to make money from concentrated liquidity pools, like for example, hedge LP setups, leverage LP setups, or even simply setting the range could determine like the actual profit and loss for each position, right? For example, that position that I showed you for the client portfolio, we went with a little bit more of a aggressive range, but in the scenario where it moves up pretty aggressively, compared to the price action of, let's say, in 2024, then that strategy would have underperformed other strategy, like just the buy and hold strategy, right? Which we also implemented in a more like diversified and complete DeFi portfolio. So inexperience could be a really bad thing because you could be running unsustainable strategies or suboptimal strategy, like the range chasing strategy. I've talked about it a lot, so I won't go into detail here. But if you're setting a range that is around like $1,000 wide or less, for example, for stuff like ETH to USDC, that kind of range is just simply not sustainable, right? When does Ethereum actually stay in the $1,000 wide range for a very long time? It doesn't really happen that often. And when it does, it's typically in like the bear market, right back here. But if you expect Ethereum's price to grow like over the next 5 to 10 years, then it doesn't really make sense to set a range that tight, right? It could be showing you like, for example, 50 to 60% APR. But if you're not in range for a whole year and you're only in range for like 2 to 3 months, then the actual APR that you get to keep is going to be way less than what it shows on like the different software. And in my opinion, just take it with a grain of salt if you see a ton of like screenshots on X with people that have like really high APR on liquidity pools, because oftentimes those APR is not going to be sustained. And if it's sustainably high APR over time, they're typically taking on much more risk, like yield farming smaller cap altcoins, for example, right? So that could be a really bad thing if you're inexperienced, you don't know what you're doing, And that's why I've released a ton of free videos on YouTube on yield farming and concentrate LPs. So be sure to check those out if you guys want to learn more, to make sure that you don't make the same mistakes that I've made when I first start yield farming these concentrated liquidity pools. And just a quick recap here. So there's 5 main things, right? The first thing is internal loss. There's ways to profit from it. For example, like the price appreciation, you could use liquidity pools as a way to dollar cost average out of your positions, right? Or dollar cost average in. The second is the asset depreciation risk. If you're going too heavily into some of these altcoins that have no solid fundamentals, or if you have no exposure into major assets, then your portfolio could be at risk because some of these assets might not make it in the long run. And the third is the smart contract risk. You want to make sure that you're yield farming on trusted protocols. The fourth is the custodian risk. Make sure that you're using multiple custodians or buying insurance for it. And the fifth is the inexperience risk. If you don't have the proper experience, it's often better to like take it slow, learn it slowly, learn by doing, right? Watch my videos. And if you could afford the course, you could grab my DeFi Blueprint course as well. It's going to be worth the time and the money that you put into it, especially if you find these videos helpful, because I go over like the step-by-step and my exact strategies, right? And I highly recommend watching this video on internal loss. It's going to give you a better overview of liquidity pools, and hopefully it helps you yield farm better and make more profit in the long run. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.